Hello, welcome to another reading of Curtis Jones' writing. Uh, I haven't posted anything in almost 2 weeks. I was afflicted with COVID 19 for a little while, but I'm back to myself now. So we're going to pick up where we left off. And the last time I did a reading, we did chapter 4 of Getting There, which is another one of the books I've written. And we're going to pick up on chapter 5. Title of this chapter is Moving a Mile High. It describes when we moved to Denver, Colorado. And I believe they call that city the Mile High City because it sets a little above 5,000 foot elevation. So let's pick up and start reading. Stephanie and I began preparation to move our family to Colorado. We settled on Denver as the place we would go. It would take us almost a month to be ready to move. I began selling the furniture and the yard equipment and anything else we could not carry in our car as we moved. We had about 2 weeks' rent paid when we made the decision to move to Colorado. During those 2 weeks, I sold or gave away everything that we could not carry in the car. When we went down to our last few pieces of furniture, we moved to mom and dad's house. We stayed there for the last 2 weeks as we divested ourselves of everything we could not carry. In that last 2 weeks, mom and dad played with our children all the time. They knew they would miss them. That gave us a lot of time to ourselves to talk about our plans and hopes for the future. We didn't have any solid plans, just a dream of how we would like it to be. Mom and dad took movie films of the children and me and Stephanie. They did not know how long it would be until they would see us again. Mom and dad had two other grandsons that lived in Modesto. However, we were taking half of their grandchildren and leaving. Denver is said to be a mile high city, and it felt like our dreams were already a mile high. When I was young, I could not see any obstacle too big to overcome. I believe Stephanie felt the same way I did. She was as excited as I was about the move. Stephanie was a little disturbed that I had to go to mom and dad's house every day. No matter what Stephanie was doing, when I came home from work or school, we would load up into the car and go spend a couple hours at mom's house. Often, we would eat supper with them. I think Stephanie saw this as an escape from those activities that I should be engaged in or shouldn't be engaged in. So the day before we were to leave for Denver, we loaded the trunk of the car with as much as we could put in it. We then began to load the back seat with clothes and other soft materials so that the kids could ride on top with a comfortable place to sit. In the trunk, we had our stereo, television, dishes, cookware. That night, Stephanie and I barely slept from the excitement that we felt about leaving. When the sun came up, we had breakfast with mom and dad, then loaded the kids into the car. Mom and dad filmed as we prepared to leave. Everybody then said his or her goodbyes. I was 22 years old, and Stephanie was 18 years old when we left for Colorado. I was young enough that I believed I could drive straight through and arrive 24 hours later. As we pulled out of the pulled out on the highway, we gave each other a good luck kiss. Our hopes were very high. The kids rode atop of all the clothes and blankets in the back seat. It seemed to be very comfortable for them. They could crawl around and lie down and even stretch out, so they did not become or became had so they did not become as tired as Stephanie and I did riding in the front seat. We had an ice chest that sat between us so that we could carry our lunch, some sandwiches that mom had prepared, and soft drinks. We did this so we didn't have to stop for anything. Everything went very smooth. The car ran like a new car. The kids were happy and did not fuss. Stephanie and I giggled and talked of our plans. It took us several hours to come to the California Nevada border. The trip had taken us into the beautiful Sierra Mountains of Northern California. We also saw very pretty small cities that emphasized their Western heritage. As we entered Nevada, we left the beautiful mountains behind. We were entering the high desert. The kids were not as easily entertained as we drove through the desert. They began to fuss, perhaps because Stephanie and I spoke much less often as we traversed this dull and boring landscape. As we would cross one hill, it would look like the valley we had just come up out of. That kind of monotony makes driving difficult. Boredom makes it hard to pay attention to what you're doing. I had an 8-track player under the dash, and by now I had played all of the music that I owned. Stephanie did not want to continue playing the same music over and over. There were no radio stations that I could pick up because I had only an AM radio. It was very early in the afternoon by the time we had reached the Nevada Utah border. I was really very tired from having sat so long in one place. We were entering the great salt flats of Utah that ran some distance, and my boredom had reached a new peak. We drove about 100 miles into Utah and decided to stop and stretch our legs. We must have spent over an hour at a little park just outside of a small town. In just a few minutes after we left the small town, we were in Salt Lake City. We couldn't see a lot of the lake, but there was enough visible that we could tell it was a very big place. As we drove to Salt Lake City, it must have been rush hour. Traffic was unbelievably difficult, worse than San Francisco in rush hour. It took some time to get through the city. As we were coming out the eastern side of Salt Lake City, the sun was beginning to go down. I drove to the mountains on the eastern side of the city. I made my way to Utah Colorado border. We were on some kind of plateau by then. The moon was very bright. that night. You could see the Rocky Mountains growing like ghostly sentinels way off in the distance. I drove until I came to Gunnison, Colorado. I needed to fuel up the car, and I was still very tired, perhaps more than I was earlier. I didn't want to waste any time. The babies were asleep, and Stephanie had been trying to nap as we finished that last 100 miles. What lay ahead of me was the start of the Rocky Mountains. They were very steep and tall. I asked a man at the service station how far it was to Denver. He said about 150 miles. I told Stephanie we would drive until we got to Denver. Then I would get us a motel room for the night. She asked if I thought I would be able to do that or make it, and I answered in the affirmative. I picked me up a cup of coffee to go as I paid for the gas. We hit the road again. I sipped on the coffee as I began to climb the mountains where some sections were very steep. About 8 or 10 miles out of town, I finished my coffee. I thought how strange to feel so tired after drinking a cup of coffee. I looked down at my speedometer and I was driving 55 miles an hour. I remember looking up at the road and thinking, the moon must be directly overhead. The ground was lit up all around me. My eyes grew heavy and my mind went into neutral. All I can think is that I fell asleep driving through those steep, curved hills at 55 miles an hour. I don't know what kept me safe in those wee hours of the morning as I slept over or sped over the Great Rocky Mountain Divide. I don't know how I managed to stay on the road, avoiding the cliffs and sharp turns and all the wildlife. When I next realized where I was pulling into the outskirts of Denver. The sun was beginning to rise, and I'd spent 3 hours driving through the mountains unaware. The love of God is made manifest when such things happen. I didn't tell Stephanie what happened for perhaps a month. She was still quite upset that I did not stop and sleep so that all would be safe. We spent the first night in a motel after we arrived. That morning early, we had breakfast, got a newspaper, and began to search for an apartment. Within 2 or 3 hours, we had found a small mobile home we could afford to rent. We paid our rent and moved in that day. The mobile home was furnished, which was to our advantage. I began searching for work the next morning, bright and early. I searched the newspapers first. Most of the help wanted ads referred you to an employment agency. I talked to several that first day. I discovered that it would cost me from $300 to $1,500 to get a job in Denver. I had run a janitorial service in my spare time for the last 3 years, so I resigned myself that I was going to have to pay to get a job. Within 3 days, I was hired to run a cleaning crew at a place called Cinderella City Shopping Mall. It was the largest indoor shopping mall in America at that time. It had 3 floors and close to 300 vendors selling goods in that mall. I started work at 10 o'clock at night. I worked until 7 o'clock in the morning. I had more than 30 men sweeping, mopping, and buffing the floors in that huge building. I was given a golf cart to drive through the building, checking on my employees. I enjoyed my job, but Stephanie was upset that she had to spend the night by herself. I slept most of the day. I felt sorry for her, and I told her I would continue to look for another job. At this job, my employer was taking $10 a week out of my check to pay the employment staffing company. I might have stayed with this job for some time except for one incident. My employer had made arrangements with the county jail to bring prisoners in to work in place of my regular employees. They told me about this on a Friday evening, saying it would begin on Monday morning. They informed all my employees that Sunday night would be their last night. I felt good that I did not have to fire those who were working for me. I had become somewhat attached to several of the men. When I went home that Saturday morning, I told Stephanie about the news. She was afraid that the prisoners might harm me in an effort to escape. I had not thought of that until Stephanie suggested the possibilities. My crew and I worked the entire weekend without a single problem. I went in early to work Monday afternoon to talk to my bosses. I asked him to retain the men I had working for me and not to bring prisoners in. I told them I was concerned for my well being. They told me there would be nothing to be concerned about. I went back home and told Stephanie what my boss had said. Stephanie said that did not change the fact that they were men who were incarcerated for being mean. She said I would be left in the mall with no guards, that only the criminals would be there and myself. She said I should consider that I had the keys that unlocked the mall so they could leave if they wished. She said that put me at risk and she did not want to lose me. I told Stephanie that I would give it a try that Monday night. If they seemed to be decent men, I would continue working. I also said that if they scared me, I would quit Monday night and I would inform my boss Tuesday morning that they would need another supervisor. I went to my office Monday evening about 9:30 and waited for the county sheriff to bring those men who had qualified for night leave working release. The deputy came in and introduced himself. He said he would bring the prisoners in at 10 o'clock, and I asked him if he thought I was in danger, to which he said not likely. That did not ease my mind very much. The deputy and his partner brought 30 men and lined them up in the hall by my office. They asked me to come out and told me they would introduce me to their prisoners, and I went out and met these men. The deputy told me they were needed back at the jail. I would be in charge of the men until 7 o'clock in the morning. As I met the men, I looked at them more closely and I noticed that they had tattoos that spoke of hate and of death. Not a single one of the prisoners seemed to be kind or nice. I think they wanted me to be afraid of them. I was before they even came in. I held the keys to every shop in my office, also to the front and back doors of the mall, hanging from my belt. The sheriff sat there while I assigned duties to each of these prisoners. I issued the supplies they needed for cleaning the floors and for drinking fountains and for restrooms. I suppose I left my imagination run wild with the thought that I could be killed and left there until I was discovered. Those men spoke with the foulest words, more than I had heard since I was in the Navy. What they were When they were close to each other after the deputies left, they would slap each other and laugh about it. I knew they had developed a hierarchy in the jail that seemed to have followed them out here to the work site. When I got off work, I went home and I told Stephanie about my night. She immediately warned me to quit the job, even if we had to leave Denver. By this time, Mom and Dad had decided to move to Stilwell, Oklahoma. Over breakfast, Stephanie and I made the decision, and I would quit this job. We would move to Stilwell. I went into my bosses at 10 o'clock that morning, telling them I would not be coming back, and asked them to send my check to General Delivery, Stilwell, Oklahoma. We had only 2 days left on our rent, so we weren't worried about paying for the next month. We devoted that money to renting a place in Stilwell. I stayed up all day. We packed the car, everything we had, and with everything we had, and made the car ready for the trip to Oklahoma. It took most of the day to make us ready. I slept with a baby that night, and we got up the next morning, folding up our bedding, putting them in the car, and heading for Oklahoma. We left about 6 o'clock that morning. It took about 15 hours to drive to Stilwell. Stephanie and I felt like a great weight had been lifted when we left that job. When we got to Stilwell, we rented a room from the Strawberry Capital Motel. The owners of that motel had a mobile home park next door. When we told them we wanted to rent a place to live, they showed us one of their trailer houses. It was cheaper and bigger than the one or last one, so we rented it. It was also furnished. We moved in that day. It kept it came with cable TV, the utilities, and it was located centrally to the business district. We had a phone put in within 2 days. We called Mom and Dad and gave them our phone number. Mom called me within a week and said they were moving back to Stilwell themselves. She said they were leaving in the morning. They would be there in 3 days. Dad brought a big trailer. They also brought Henry and Carrie, my little brother and sister. They asked if they could leave them with Stephanie and that they wanted to take me to help drive other equipment back. Stephanie and I had Michael, who was 2 years old, and Brian, who was 1 year old. Stephanie did not want to babysit the two children plus our children, but she agreed to do so while I went with them to help move them back. Dad bought a 30-acre place on Workman Mountain. He took the trailer that he had brought with him and parked it on that place. The next morning, we were headed to California. Dad picked up an extended cab. Dad's pickup was an extended cab pickup, so we three adults, Mom, Dad, and myself, could ride comfortably. We drove straight through going to California, which took 36 hours. We got to their house just about dark the next day. We had hamburgers for supper and slept in sleeping bags. We finished loading up their truck, their trailer, and their bus. It was a 1948 International school bus. It was a vehicle I was supposed to drive back to Oklahoma. This bus had bunk beds in it. It contained all of Dad's tools along with his welder and torch. This bus was loaded very heavy. I called Stephanie that day and I told her we would head back early the next morning. I said I thought it would take us 3 days to get there because we would sleep each night. On the trip back, we brought my little sister Diane. She had been staying with my big sister Betty while Mom and Dad brought Henry and Carrie the first trip. Pardon me. We had driven about 150 miles south from Modesto. The trailer Dad was pulling with his truck had a wheel bearing go out, and we had to stop. It took half the day for Dad get to go get the bearing and to replace it. I helped him with the repairs. We were once again on our way. We made it to Mojave, California. Mojave is the first town you enter in the Mojave Desert, and we spent the night just east of town. It was in the desert. We circled the bus, the car, and the trailer like wagon train. We gathered wood, built a fire, and Mom cooked our supper right there. I was tired, so I slept very well. I slept in the school bus bottom bunk, and Diane slept on the top bunk. Mom and Dad had a bed made in the back end of the pickup. We rose early the next morning. We were driving by the time it got daylight. By 10 o'clock, we were entering Arizona. Things went along very well. We didn't have any more trouble. We camped the next night in the border between Arizona and New Mexico. When we knew it would take 2 more days to get home. The next morning early, we stopped to gas up all three vehicles. Pardon me. I called Stephanie and told her it would be the next day and in the evening before I got home. She pleaded with me to please hurry. Babysitting Henry and Carrie was driving her nuts, she said. We took off the next uh, morning and followed close by each other until we stopped for lunch. We ate hamburgers and got on the road again. This afternoon, I wanted to call Stephanie, so I picked up a pop for Diane and for myself. To do this, I rushed on ahead of everyone. When I pulled into the station, Diane and I went to the bathroom. We got our pops, and I called Stephanie. I can only guess that Dad could not see the big yellow bus when he passed the station where Diane and I were. There was a rock wall at the far end of the awning. It may have hidden the bus from his view. I only had $35 on me. Dad had been paying all the expenses to move his stuff to Oklahoma. I had over half a tank of gas in the bus. Diane and I pulled out close to the highway and waited about half an hour. We never saw Dad or Mom pass. I told her I thought we might have missed them, and we started driving east at a slower pace. I hoped they might catch up to us. The next town we came to was the last town in New Mexico. We went to the Highway Patrol office and asked them for help. We asked that they stop Mom and Dad if they seen them on the road and tell them where we are. We sat in front of the Highway Patrol office for 2 hours. I checked with them before we started down the road again. They told me they had stopped Dad and told him where I was. He was further east from us. He had passed us while we were stopped. I told Diane that we would head that direction, so we headed out eastbound, watching for Mom and Dad. We thought they might have stopped on the side of the road waiting for us. I didn't learn until I got home that Dad did not stop. He kept driving eastbound, but he slowed his pace to 10 miles by 10 miles an hour. We were 20 miles west of him. It would have taken at least 2 hours to catch up. I had to buy gas before we left that town. I had enough gasoline to drive to Amarillo, Texas. During all this time, I tried to drive the speed limit so that I could catch up to Dad. I never did catch up. I was beginning to run out of gas as we came to Amarillo. I told Diane I did not know what we were going to do. We would pull into the truck stop and figure out from there what we should do. Diane and I went into the coffee shop and at the truck stop, and we sat there in the cafe. A hitchhiker from England came up to Diane and I and said he was going east. He if asked us if he could have a ride as far east as we were going. I told him that we weren't going anywhere because I had run out of money and we needed gasoline. He said, I have money for gasoline, but I don't have a vehicle. Why don't I buy your gas and you can take me east as far as the gas goes? I told him I thought that was a good idea because Diane and I could keep traveling. Perhaps we would catch up to Dad. I pulled the bus up to the gas pumps and filled it up. As I was filling up the gas tank, the little Englishman sat in the driver's seat of that old bus. As I walked around to the door of the bus, the little Englishman was sitting in the driver's seat, smiling. It was $30 for the gasoline. He said, uh, he and I walked inside and he paid for it. And as we walked back to the bus, this man asked me if he could drive the bus when we left. I asked him if he knew how to drive and if he had a driver's license. He answered that he did. When we got on the bus, he sat in the driver's seat. He asked how to start the bus, and that should have been my first indication that maybe he did not know how to drive. This bus had a button on the floor that you pressed with your foot to engage the starter. So I thought perhaps he did not know how to drive. He did know how to drive, but he had never seen a vehicle this old. I explained to him how to start the bus, and he put it into neutral and he started it. He seemed to have a little trouble putting it into first gear. He ground the gears as he tried to engage them. The bus gave a jerk when he left out the clutch. That worried me just a little bit, but I thought once he got on the road, he would not have to shift anymore. and we would be okay. I was just thankful that someone was going to help me get out of this mess I found myself in. As we pulled out of the parking lot, he did better with shifting. He had to stop once more before we turned onto the ramp for the freeway. He made his right hand turn as we started moving. He shifted to first gear and then to second gear. And as we began speeding up, as he was ready to shift to third gear, there was an awful cracking sound as though metal had scraped against metal. The bus began to slow down. He pulled off onto the right shoulder. We were 100 yards from the entrance to the freeway. As the bus stopped, he pulled he as the bus stopped, he pulled on the emergency brake, and he left the motor running. He stood up from the driver's seat, and I was standing right beside him. He looked me right in the eyes, and he said, "I am so sorry." He opened the door to the bus. He stepped down those 3 or 4 steps onto the dirt. He turned and left and started walking down the freeway away from us. I tried to reason what might be the problem with the bus. The motor ran fine, but I could not engage the clutch. So when I tried to shift, all I could do is grind the gears in the transmission. I was afraid I would destroy the transmission if I kept trying. I once had a pickup that lost its clutch, and in an emergency, I could put the pickup in first gear and turn the starter. The pickup would start and run in first gear without engaging the clutch. I could continue to shift by speeding up or slowing down the engine, and I tried to do this with the bus, but it was loaded so heavy the starter could barely move the bus while it was in first gear. I knew this was not going to work. It was late afternoon. After having sat there for 2 or 3 hours thinking about our worsening situation, I told Diane that we were only 2 hours from the Oklahoma border, then only 400 miles to home. I told her I thought we ought to hitchhike our way home and leave the bus sitting there. Diane said that was okay. She thought it would be fun. So Diane and I started walking eastbound until we reached the end of the on ramp at the interstate. I started holding my thumb up and trying to catch a ride. We might have stood there for another hour. A man stopped that was driving a Chrysler New Yorker. He looked like a it looked like a new car to me. He was dressed in expensive clothes. Uh, I sat in the front seat and Diane sat in the back. So we started driving. By this time, I didn't have a penny to my name. As he drove along, I told him the story of how we came to be hitchhiking on the interstate, how the bus had just broken down. He said he was going to have to stop and get some gasoline himself. By this time, we were just about at the border of Oklahoma. I asked him if he could buy me a pack of cigarettes, which upset him terribly. He told me we would have to catch another ride because he wasn't sure that Diane was even my sister. He looked, she looked about 12 years old. We walked down the entrance ramp to the interstate. Diane and I stood there with our thumbs held out for about 5 minutes, and a semi truck stopped to give us a ride. We crawled into this cab of that old truck. He said he was going to Little Rock, Arkansas. We told him we were going to Sallisaw, Oklahoma. He knew exactly where that was. We rode with this truck driver for 6 or 7 hours. When he drove till 1:30 in the morning, when he let us off at Sallisaw, he had asked us if we would ride with him to Little Rock and back. Uh, he said he would uh, drive us up to Stilwell, where we were going, and I told him thank you for the ride, but I thought we could make it there by 4 or so in the morning if we had any luck. Excuse me. Diane and I walked about half a mile to a truck stop on the east end of Sallisaw. There was a young kid just coming out of the truck stop. We flagged him down and asked him for a ride to Stilwell. He told us he would be very happy to drive us all the way to Stilwell. We got into his car and headed north out of Sallisaw. I knew we would be home in an hour. There we go. This kid was probably 17 years old. He said he worked at the truck stop, washing dishes. He had just got off work and he was headed home. That was about 1:30 in the morning. Diane and I got in his car and he headed north. We had driven about halfway to Stilwell when he stopped his car. Pardon me. He said he was going to turn off the road there. I reminded him that he said he was going to drive us to Stilwell. He simply said he changed his mind. Now it was about halfway or 3:30 in the morning. Diane and I started walking up this very dark highway. It was difficult to see the road, but I followed the white line on the right side of the road. We made our way to the top of the hill about a half a mile. There was a street light against the highway. At that point, and a house about 100 yards off the road. We stopped under the light and waited for a car to come by. We may have stood there 15 minutes when the first car came, holding out our hopes for a ride. The car didn't even slow down. Diane and I stood out there for a good 2 hours, hoping for a ride. We had no luck at all. Then I noticed the barn about 50 yards off the road. It had a fence around this side of the barn. There were 2 or 3 calves in that area. I watched the calves acting agitated. I noticed to my left a light colored beast moving. My attention then shifted from those calves to the new creature I was looking at. It walked like a cat. I then noticed it had a long tail that curved up at the end. My heart began to race as I realized I was looking at a mountain lion. I looked over at Diane. She was watching down the road, looking for headlights. I watched this lion as it jumped over the fence in a single bound. It took one of the calves in its throat, or by its throat, and the calf was perhaps a week old. So they were not very big. They didn't make a lot of noise as the they didn't make a lot of noise as they bellowed. As the cat took one by the throat, the others ran to the far end of the pen. I felt a little better knowing that this animal had already caught its dinner. It jumped over the fence toward me, or in my direction, with the calf in its mouth. That gave me a terrible fright. I decided we ought to leave that place. I looked at Diane to see that she had not seen anything yet. I was afraid if I told her what I had seen, she would begin to become scared and start running, and the animal would chase us. I called to Diane and said, "Let's walk down this way," which was away from the light and towards Stilwell. She and I started walking north along that road. I watched the big cat out of the corner of my eye. It no longer had the calf in its mouth. It walked along that fence the same direction we did. I became more alarmed because I knew mountain lions see children as prey animals. I wasn't so much afraid for me as I was for my little sister. I told her, "Let's turn around and go walk back to the light." She complied and with my request, and I noticed that the big cat also turned and walked the same direction we did. I was surprised it didn't run away for fear of humans. Fear was just about to overcome me when I heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel truck coming up the highway. I looked over at the big cat. It was standing over the dead calf. So Diane, so with Diane standing there under the street light and me next to her, I stepped out in front of the semi truck and began to wave my arms. I closed my eyes as I heard the tires on that truck begin to squeal. I wasn't sure if I would survive, but I knew that he would have to take my little sister with him one way or the other. The truck was able to stop 10 to 15 feet before it came to me. I was so relieved to see that. I ran up to the and opened the door on the passenger side and told him what I had just seen. He looked over that direction to see what he could see. The cat was no longer there. You could barely see the calf laying by the fence. I don't think he even saw the calf. I helped Diane into the truck and I crawled in right behind her. This driver told me he didn't believe anything I had said. However, he would give us a ride to Stilwell, nonetheless. He let us off at the north end of town. We had only 100 yards to walk to get to my house. We walked to the house. I knocked on the door. Stephanie came and opened the door for us. She told me Mom and Dad had arrived there at 2 in the morning that same night. I think how stubborn he must have been not to drive back and pick us up. His trip took almost as long as mine. Mom and Dad got up because of the commotion when Diane and I got home. I told them what had happened and that the bus was still in Amarillo, Texas. Dad told me we would be having to go back and repair it and bring it to Stilwell. Steph, pardon me. Stephanie told him that I was going to sleep that day because I was exhausted. We would start that trip tomorrow morning. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter of the book. I will continue to read these, but I do have some bad news. Until the 16th of September, I have a web page which is curtis-jones-books.squarespace.com. On the 16th of September, they are doubling the price for my website, and so I will probably be canceling that. I don't intend to pay them double. But I also have the Curtis Jones author page on Facebook, which has all the information this site has, but it doesn't cost me anything. I'll eventually find me another website and set it up, but for now, that's what I'm going to have to do. I thank everybody for the support I get from them. And if you like what I do, hit the like button, hit the bell so you can be notified when I post things, and tell your friends about it. I think these are good stories. They're all true stories. They all really happened. And the next time we come together, I'll be reading Fun with Kids, which is chapter 6 of this book. This book contains historical stories from my family history, and it also contains stories that didn't get in any of the other books that I've written, but I figured they needed to be published nonetheless. Thank you for your time and your support. God bless you and keep you. Until next time, bye bye.